Security cameras at Cozy Corner Bar captured everything at exactly 8:15 p.m. on March 21, 1986. What was Tommy Maronei, a 300-pound professional bodybuilder, thinking when he challenged John Gotti in front of an entire Queen's bar? Why did the muscle-bound giant believe his physical size could intimidate the head of the Gambino crime family? How did one man's overconfidence turn into the most educational confrontation in mob history? This is the story of when brute force met organized power, and what happened when someone confused being big with being dangerous. It started that Friday evening when John Gotti sat at his usual table near the front window of Cozy Corner Bar on Atlantic Avenue in South Ozone Park. At 45, Gotti had been boss of the Gambino family for 3 months since orchestrating Paul Castellano's murder outside Sparks Steakhouse. He was still consolidating power, still proving to capos and soldiers that his leadership would be different from Castellano's distant businessman approach. The bar served as Gotti's informal headquarters, where neighborhood residents understood that certain conversations at certain tables weren't meant to be overheard. It maintained the perfect balance between legitimate neighborhood joint and organized crime meeting place. "The Brooklyn guys are falling in line," Sammy Gravano reported across the small table, keeping his voice low. "But we still got some resistance from the old-timers who think you moved too fast against Paul." Gotti sipped his scotch, watching traffic pass on Atlantic Avenue. Let them think what they want. Results speak louder than opinions. That's when Tommy Maronei walked through the front door. At 6'4" and 300 pounds of solid muscle, Maronei commanded attention wherever he went. The 32-year-old professional bodybuilder had competed in regional competitions and built a local reputation doing security work and debt collection. His success came from simple intimidation. Most people took one look at his massive frame and decided compliance was easier than confrontation. But Tommy Maronei's success had created a dangerous blind spot. He'd started believing that physical size equaled real power, that his 300 pounds of muscle made him untouchable, regardless of who he confronted or what organizations they represented. Maronei had been hired to collect a debt from someone who regularly drank at Cozy Corner. He'd entered looking for his target, but instead noticed John Gotti sitting near the window. Recognition flickered across his face. He'd seen Gotti in newspapers and on television, the famous mobster who'd just taken over New York's most powerful crime family. Instead of keeping his distance, Tommy Maronei made a decision that would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. He walked directly to Gotti's table, positioning his massive frame to maximize intimidation. His shadow fell across the table as he towered over the seated crime boss, outweighing Gotti by at least 150 pounds. "John Gotti," Maronei announced loudly enough for the entire bar to hear, his voice carrying the aggressive confidence that had worked for years against regular people. "I've been reading about you in the papers. Everyone's talking about how you're the new boss, how dangerous you are, how everyone's supposed to be afraid of you." The bar fell completely silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every patron turned to stare because Tommy Maronei had just publicly challenged the head of the Gambino crime family. "But looking at you now," Maronei continued, enjoying the attention, "you don't look so dangerous to me. You look like a small man in an expensive suit who's gotten by on reputation rather than anything real. I bet without your bodyguards and your organization, you're just another little guy who'd get destroyed in any actual physical confrontation." Gotti's 3 capos immediately reached for their weapons, understanding that their boss had been insulted and that this situation required immediate, brutal response. But Gotti held up his hand, stopping them from drawing guns. Then John Gotti did something that witnesses later described as both the most confident and most frightening response possible. He laughed. A genuine delighted laugh that filled the silent bar, showing he found this entire situation amusing rather than threatening. "Tommy Maronei," Gotti said, still smiling, his voice carrying amusement that was somehow more intimidating than anger would have been. 300 pounds of muscle. Professional bodybuilder. I've heard about you. You collect debts for local businessmen. You do security work. You intimidate people with your size. Gotti leaned back in his chair, took a sip of his scotch, maintained eye contact with the giant still looming over his table. "And you've been successful at it, because most people you confront are just regular guys who don't know how to handle someone your size. They look at you and decide paying the debt is easier than fighting you. That's smart business. Use your advantages. I respect that. But Tommy," Gotti continued, his voice now carrying an edge that made everyone in the bar understand this was education rather than casual conversation. "Here's what you don't understand. Here's the lesson you're about to learn that will either make you smarter or get you killed, depending on how quickly you comprehend what I'm telling you." The massive bodybuilder's confident expression began to falter as something in Gotti's tone suggested this wasn't going the way Maronei had expected. "Size doesn't matter in my world. Being 300 pounds doesn't matter. Being stronger than everyone else doesn't matter. You know why?" Gotti stood up, his 5'10" inches frame obviously much smaller than Maronei's 6'4" inches physique, but the size difference somehow made Gotti's complete lack of fear even more striking. "Because I'm not going to fight you, Tommy. I'm never going to fight you. If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't stand up and trade punches with you. I'd have my guys shoot you. If I wanted you hurt, I wouldn't challenge you to arm wrestling. I'd have people break your legs while you sleep." The brutal clarity of Gotti's words hit Maronei like a physical blow. The framework he'd used successfully for years, size equals power, physical dominance equals control, suddenly revealed itself as completely irrelevant in this environment. Size is irrelevant when confronting people who understand that real power comes from organization, from loyalty, from being willing to use methods that don't depend on personal physical strength. Maronei's aggressive posture deflated as he processed what Gotti was saying, realizing he'd walked into a situation where his greatest advantage meant absolutely nothing. "You challenged me publicly, called me small, suggested I'm only powerful because of my organization. Like that's some kind of weakness rather than the entire point." Gotti's voice remained friendly, but now carried menace that made everyone listening understand this was serious education. "You thought your 300 pounds would intimidate me. You fundamentally misunderstood how power works in my world." The bar remained completely silent as John Gotti delivered what amounted to a masterclass in the difference between physical strength and real authority. "Here's what's going to happen, Tommy. You're going to apologize for insulting me. You're going to apologize loudly enough that everyone in this bar hears you acknowledge that you made a mistake. And then you're going to leave. And you're going to spend the rest of your life being grateful that I found your ignorance amusing rather than offensive." Maronei stood frozen, finally understanding that he'd made a catastrophic error, that his physical advantages provided no protection against organized crime authority, that Gotti's laughter had been more frightening than anger because it demonstrated complete confidence. "I apologize," Maronei said, his voice lacking all the aggressive confidence it had carried minutes earlier. "Mr. Gotti, I apologize. I didn't understand. I made a mistake. I'm sorry for insulting you. Please, I didn't mean any real disrespect." Gotti's smile warmed, showing genuine appreciation for Maronei's recognition of error and willingness to learn. "Good. That shows intelligence, Tommy. That shows you're capable of learning. Now listen carefully because this could save your life someday." Gotti sat back down, picked up his drink, continued his education. "Size is an advantage in certain situations, bar fights, security work, intimidating regular people who don't know how to handle physical confrontation. In those situations, being 300 pounds of muscle is valuable. But when you're dealing with organized crime, when you're in environments where people have access to weapons and organizations and no moral qualms about using lethal violence, size becomes irrelevant. Actually, it becomes a disadvantage because it makes you overconfident. Gotti's tone remained instructional rather than threatening. You want to keep working as a bodybuilder and debt collector? Fine, be successful at it, but stay away from mob business. Don't collect debts from people who are connected. Don't confront people in bars where organized crime conducts business. And never again walk up to someone like me and challenge them based on size comparison. That's how you get killed, Tommy. That's how 300 pounds of muscle ends up dead in an alley, because you thought being big protected you from people who understand that power has nothing to do with physical strength. Gotti made a dismissive gesture. Now leave. Go back to your regular life. Remember this lesson and be grateful that I found you amusing rather than insulting. Maronei left Cozy Corner Bar immediately, understanding that his entire framework for comprehending power had been demolished in 10 minutes. Physical size meant nothing when confronting organizational authority. John Gotti's laughter had been more devastating than any beating, because it demonstrated that Maronei's greatest advantage was viewed as completely irrelevant. The story spread through Queens within hours, becoming legend that illustrated the difference between physical dominance and real power. Guards who heard it learned about authority versus strength. Fellow criminals understood why John Gotti commanded respect through intelligence rather than intimidation. For Tommy Maronei, the encounter was transformative. He continued working as a bodybuilder and security professional, continued using his size to handle legitimate confrontations. But he never again attempted to challenge organized crime figures, never again made the mistake of assuming physical advantages translated to protection against systematic violence. Maronei later told friends that John Gotti's laughter haunted him, that understanding how completely his challenge had been dismissed taught him more about real danger than any physical fight ever could. The March 1986 encounter demonstrated something important about John Gotti's character and understanding of power. Gotti could have responded with immediate violence, could have made a brutal example that would have been straightforward and terrifying. Instead, he chose education, explaining why Maronei's challenge was irrelevant, demonstrating power through confidence rather than cruelty. This response served multiple purposes. It showed everyone watching that Gotti was secure enough in his authority, that physical challenges didn't threaten him. It demonstrated mercy that built respect. Gotti could have killed Maronei, but chose to educate him instead. The story became part of Gotti's mythology, alongside tales of his ruthlessness, showing a leader confident enough to laugh at physical intimidation, wise enough to teach rather than simply destroy. Years later, law enforcement officials who studied Gotti's methods would point to the Maronei encounter as typical of his leadership style: intelligent, educational, and absolutely confident in the distinction between authority and physical power. The night a 300-pound bodybuilder confronted John Gotti became Queen's legend, not because of violence or brutality, but because of laughter that was more intimidating than threats, education that was more devastating than beating, and mercy that demonstrated absolute authority. Tommy Maronei learned that real power had nothing to do with muscle mass and everything to do with organization, intelligence, and understanding when and how to use violence rather than relying on personal physical capability. March 21st, 1986. The giant who didn't understand power. The mob boss who laughed. The lesson that probably saved a life by teaching someone to recognize situations where size provided no protection and where continued aggression would result in death rather than submission.